I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 13, Sunday, November 26, 2023. The lesson is entitled Judgment and Exile. Lesson text comes from 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 15 through 21, and Psalms 137, 1 through 6. Related scriptures are 2 Kings 24, 10 through 16, Jeremiah 25, 8 through 11, Leviticus 26, 40 through 45, Psalms 48, 1 through 14, and 126, 1 through 6. The places are Jerusalem and Babylon. The times are 586 BC and sometime after 586 BC. It is amazing what we miss when we suddenly do not have things we always enjoyed and took for granted. Americans have typically taken for granted their freedom to worship, their right to travel, and their right to free speech. But when we go through something like the COVID-19 lockdowns, many things in life feel very uncertain. What was once routine all at once becomes unrealistic. We may suddenly realize what is truly dear to us and what is really important in life. Today's aim, facts. To examine the plight of God's people in exile in Babylon. Principle, to show that God punishes us as his children when we forget our blessings from him and his call for our obedience. Application, to demonstrate that we dare not forget how much God has blessed us, for doing so can lead to chastisement. Illustrating the lesson. God punishes his children when they stop listening to him. Practical points. 1. Continually ignoring God's warnings is a recipe for having to learn things the hard way. 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 17. 2. God's judgment on a people is commensurate with pervasive sin. Verses 18 through 21. 3. The scorn of the godless is especially painful when we are being disciplined by God for sin. Psalms 137, 1 through 3. 4. It is difficult to witness for the Lord when we have strayed out of his revealed will. Verse 4. 5. Remembering one's godly heritage may be the first step back for someone who has fallen away from the Lord. Verses 5 through 6. Golden text. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. Psalms 137, 1. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is compassion. 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 16. The second is conquest, 2 Chronicles 36, 17 through 21. And the third is complaint, Psalms 137, 1 through 6. Introduction. In King Josiah's time, Huldah, the prophetess, foretold the trouble waiting for Judah. God was going to allow righteous Josiah to reign in peace, but when he was gone, divine judgment would fall on Judah. Huldah's warning was very clear. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will bring evil upon this place and upon the inhabitants thereof, even all the words of the book which the king of Judah have read, because they have forsaken me, and have burned incense unto other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath shall be kindled against this place, and shall not be quenched. 2 Kings 22, 16 through 17. There was a persistent tendency for the Israelites to divide their allegiance between Yahweh and a host of false gods. The idolatry this spawned was abomination to the Lord and could not be allowed to continue. This time reckoning had come. Comparison, 2 Chronicles 36, 15. And the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. Verse 16. But they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. Message. 2 Chronicles 36:15. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began his 11-year reign in Jerusalem. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, verse 12. He refused to humble himself before the prophet Jeremiah, who was God's spokesman. King Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, to whom he had sworn allegiance. All of his chief priests and the people in general became involved in pagan abominations and polluted the hallowed house of God in Israel, in Jerusalem, verses 13 through 14. God's cup of wrath was filling up and ready to boil over. The people of Judah may not have deserved it, but God sent them messengers from time to time to warn them to give up their evil ways and turn back to him. He did this because he had compassion on his chosen people and on his dwelling place among them, the temple in Jerusalem. These messengers were God's prophets, mocking. 2 Chronicles 36:16. Sadly, the people mocked, ridiculed, derided, and treated with contempt God's messengers. They despised the words of God and misused or scoffed at his prophets. This continued for such a long time that the Lord's wrath was poured out on his people. There was no remedy to stop it, no healing to cure it, and no way to escape it. Today we live in a world that is very similar. God sends his words out to warn people to abandon their sins. He uses personal exhortation by true believers. He uses churches, parachurch organizations, schools, literature, radio and television broadcasts, and various other means. Yet often the same thing happens as took place in ancient Israel. The people mock his messages and make themselves ripe for divine judgment. Satan is still hard at work. Conquest. Verse 17. Therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young man or maiden, old man or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand. Verse 18. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king, and of his princes, and all these he brought to Babylon. Verse 19. And they burnt the house of God, and brake down the wall of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. Verse 20. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Verse 21. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Slain. 2 Chronicles 36:17. God used the Chaldeans, Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, to chastise his people. The Lord had led Abraham out of the paganism in Ur of the Chaldeans, Genesis 11:31, to go to the promised land of Canaan. After his descendants settled in Canaan, after they went to Egypt in Jacob's time, after they made the exodus from bondage there, and after they took Canaan back from the heathen, they were now at the mercy of Babylon and headed back to the land of the Chaldees as captives. Nebuchadnezzar was intent on destroying what the Jews had built up in Judah. He sent his soldiers to slay young men, even in the sanctuary of the sacred temple. No compassion was shown to men or women, young or old. It was a violent conquest, a bloody massacre. The Babylonians had held the city of Jerusalem under siege for a long time. The book of Lamentations, written by Jeremiah, describes the horror of that period. When the enemies finally broke through the city's defenses, they were in no mood to be merciful. What made it even more painful was that the Lord sanctioned it as a means of divine discipline. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Hebrews 10:31. Spoiling. Second Chronicles 36:18. During the reign of King Hezekiah, Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys to visit Hezekiah in Jerusalem. Hezekiah was so proud of his treasures that he showed them to these men. The prophet Hezekiah rebuked him for doing this and prophesied that the Babylonians would eventually return and carry Judah's people and treasures away. Isaiah 39:1-8. This now came to pass with the fall of Jerusalem. In ancient times, conquering armies made a habit of ramshacking the vanquished. In later times, defeated nations were forced to make reputations to their conquerors. Nebuchadnezzar saw to it that the precious vessels of the house of God and its treasures, along with those of the king and his princes, were carted off to Babylon. This was not just robbery, it was humiliating and sacrilegious to the Jews. Sacking, 2 Chronicles 36:19. It was common practice for a conquering army to sack a community, plundering, looting, and destroying buildings, walls, and equipment. Jerusalem was subjected to this horrifying action. The beautiful temple was burned, the stones in the city walls were thrown down, and the Pulache homes of the nobles were set afire. Jeremiah described Judah's utter defeat, a judgment he had spent his life warning Judah about. King Hezekiah and his army were captured when they tried to escape from the besieged Jerusalem. Jeremiah 52:7-8. Nebuchadnezzar slaughtered Zedekiah's sons in front of him, put his eyes out, and imprisoned him. Verses 10-11. The other royal officials were rounded up and executed. Verses 25-27. Serving, 2 Chronicles 36:20-21. In cases where individuals or groups were able to escape the carnage brought on Jerusalem and the outlying area of Judah, the Babylonians rounded many of them up and led them away to Babylon, where they became servants. They remained there until Persia superseded Babylonia. It is true that the Jews serving in Babylon were not treated as harshly as the Israelites had been treated by their Egyptian taskmasters. Through the prophet Jeremiah, the Lord told the exiles to settle down and live at peace in Babylon. Jeremiah 29:4-9. In fact, many remained there after the captivity was lifted 70 years later, while others returned to rebuild Judah. Leviticus 25:1-7 shows that God's law required the land to lay fallow every seventh year as a Sabbath rest. Jeremiah 25:11 and 29:10 states that the Holy Land would remain desolate during the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. The sense of 2 Chronicles 36:21 seems to be that the land had to rest for 70 years to make up for the 5 centuries the Sabbath rest had not been observed every 7 years. Complaint. Psalms 137:1. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. Verse 2. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. Verse 3. For they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. Verse 4. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Verse 5. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Verse 6. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. Rivers, Psalms 137, 1 through 2. Note that this psalm has no composer ascribed to it. It has been called the Song of the Exiles. The grief expressed may be somewhat tied to how the Jews were treated in Babylon, but it is primarily concerned with what they had been forced to leave behind when they were taken out of their beloved land and taken to the east. It was by the rivers of Babylon that they sat down and wept as they remembered Zion. Zion was originally a hill held by the Jebusites until David took it from them. It became the temple area and eventually a synonym for the city of Jerusalem itself. It was the core location in Jewish life, and to lose it was very difficult indeed. Verse 2 says that the captives hung their harps on the willows. The harps mentioned here were the Hebrew kinnarot, stringed instruments played for plucking. A more common name is lyre, for this instrument did not resonate like a big harp. The Jews eventually kept them up off the ground when not in use by hanging them on tree branches. The sadness of the exiles is reflected in the fact that their musical instruments were not in use. Requirements, Psalms 137, 3 through 4. The psalm now explains that the captors required the Jews to sing and at least pretend that they were happy to do this. They would say, "Sing us one of those songs of Zion." We are not told whether the Babylonians did this to taunt their captives or whether they had another motive. It may have been that they wanted to rub salt in the wounds of these unhappy exiles, considering this a source of entertainment. On the other hand, the Babylonians may have felt sympathetic toward the Jews and perhaps were trying to snap them out of their mournful attitude. Another possibility is that they were genuinely curious to learn about Jerusalem by listening to the lyrics of their songs. We may not know just what the Babylonians were thinking, but the Jews made it clear that they found it too difficult to sing the Lord's songs in a strange land. Verse 4. Their grief overpowered their desire to enjoy the pleasure of singing. This incident raises two questions we might consider. First, what should we do if we are ever under the denomination of enemies who demand that we do something we do not want to do? Should we try to accommodate them and gain their favor and the good treatment it may provide? Perhaps. But if anything requires us to go against God and His Word, we must refuse and be ready to accept the consequences. We must act on the principle that we ought to obey God rather than man. Acts 5:29. Then we must trust God to give us sustaining grace and eventual deliverance. The second question we might consider is, how can we use our enemies' demands as an opportunity to witness to them? When Paul and Silas were jailed in Philippi, they prayed and sang praises to God at midnight, and all the other prisoners heard them. A divinely sent earthquake freed Paul and Silas, and as a result of their testimony, the jailer and his household became converts. 16:25 through 34. We should never place limits on where or how we can make our testimonies effective. Remembrance, Psalms 137, 5 through 6. It appears that the Jewish exiles in Babylon were not about to be cajoled or forced into singing for their captors. Perhaps they decided this would be sacrilegious because it would have been equivalent to decorating the city that was associated with the only true God. The psalmist declared that if he ever forgot Jerusalem, his right hand should lose its cunning or skill. That would make it impossible to play the lyre. This was the instrumental component in the ability to make music. He also said that if he ever failed to remember Jerusalem, his tongue should stick to the roof of his mouth. He wanted this to happen if at any time he did not find the thought of Jerusalem superior to the most joyful thing he could imagine. Such an impediment would make it impossible to sing, which is the focal component in the ability to make music. Music has been an integral part of Jewish and Christian worship, whether personal or corporate. Job 35:10 refers to God my maker, who giveth songs in the night. In Ephesians 5:19, Paul urges, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Psalms 137 ends on a very dark note, revealing the abiding hatred for Babylon then existing in the hearts of Jewish exiles. Not only did they refuse to play their lyres and sing for their captors, but the psalmist also had harsh things to say about Edom and Babylon. Verse 7 calls on God to remember the Edomites who, on the day Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonians, called for the city to be razed, torn down to the ground. Verse 8 addresses Babylon as a nation to be destroyed. Happiness is ascribed to whoever does to it what it had done to Judah. Questions. 1. What messengers did God send to warn his people? 2. How did the Jews treat the messengers God sent to them? 3. What pagans did God use to chastise his people? 4. How would you describe the attack on Jerusalem? 5. What did the Babylonians carry away from the temple in Jerusalem? 6. What happened to the temple, city wall, and important buildings in Jerusalem? 7. How long were the Jewish captives made to serve in Babylon? 8. What did the Jewish exiles do when they remembered Zion? 9. What did the Babylonians ask the Jewish captives to do while they were in exile? 10. How strongly did the Jewish exiles feel about Jerusalem? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, November 26, 2023. Thank you for listening. God bless.